Hey there, I'm Mattea Roach, and welcome to Bookends. It's December, the bells are ringing, the snow may or may not be glistening wherever you are, so today on the show, we're bringing you some festive cheer, along with a dose of nostalgia. You'll hear my onstage conversation with Nita Prose from CBC's annual holiday fundraiser, which raises money and donations for local food banks across the country. When Nita Prose released her debut novel, The Maid, in 2022, she was brimming with excitement and also a hint of nervousness, I think. What would people think of her work as a writer? Nita had already edited many other writers in her day job as a publishing executive, but releasing your own words into the world is a different sort of nail-biter. And so Nita Prose took a breath, gave herself the pen name Nita Prose, and plunged headlong into the writing life. The Maid hit shelves and skyrocketed to New York Times bestseller status, selling over 2 million copies worldwide. Now there's a movie version of The Maid in the works, plus a sequel that's out in the world, and a fun little novella called The Mistletoe Mystery. And in this third book in Nita's Maid series, readers are being reunited with main character Molly Gray. She's a lovable, detail-obsessed maid at a fancy, very posh 5-star hotel. But in this edition of the Maid Mysteries, Molly is not solving a murder. She's trying to unravel a more personal kind of mystery. And along the way, Molly immerses herself in holiday traditions and secrets as she tries to puzzle out if she's misjudged the person she loves the most. Nita Prose is the author of The Mistletoe Mystery, and Nita joins me on stage now. Hi, Nita. Thank you so much for coming in.
Oh, my goodness. I am so happy to be here.
So are you a big holiday season, big Christmas person?
Now, I don't want to be bah humbug or anything, but there are bigger ones than me. I do know lots of people who put their tree up in August and they take it down in June, right? I'm not one of those.
No?
No.
What do you have a rule in your house for when does the tree have to come down?
Absolutely, and when it goes up. I am a December 1st person. But by December 1st, I'm truly good and ready to put that tree up, and I enjoy every second of the festivities from there until the end of the holidays, until January.
I think that's a very good balanced approach, I'm wondering, what inspired you to write a holiday mystery? Obviously you're enough of a fan of the holidays to want to put this little novella out into the world that just plunges us right into the Christmas season.
I think when the holidays come around, many of us think about those that we remember that aren't with us anymore. And that's what happened to me. One day I was sitting in my office and the holidays were coming and I was thinking of my mom, who I lost many years ago. And she was one of those people who brought celebration with her everywhere she went. She was the life of the party, and Christmas was her favorite time of year. She decorated madly. Everybody was welcome in our home, always. And she made that season so magical, so kind, and so bright. So I was remembering, just what a force she was and how she did that with so much naturalness. And I turned around on my bookshelf and I saw something, a gift that she'd given me for Christmas many, many years ago when I was just a kid. And it was this little heart-shaped box, and the top of it was painted. She'd painted it herself. And on the back of it was the only thing that I have that has her handwriting on it, and it says, "Love, Mom."
Aww.
And I picked up that box, and I just thought to myself, she's still here, she's right here, I will never spend a holiday without her. And just like that, the idea for this book came to my mind, and I gave Molly a box, a heart-shaped box, a little bit different than the one I own, and I thought of how much she would miss her gran at times like the holidays, at Christmas, on her birthday, and I wanted to bring that spirit of forever to Molly and her grand.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think a lot of people probably in the audience and who are listening perhaps on broadcast can relate to having that one person in their family who makes the holiday season so special, or if you're lucky, like multiple people that really bring that spirit to the time. My mom is a big holiday person. She recently downsized, so she's like trying to figure out right now which Christmas decorations can still go up in the new apartment and like how to reorient everything. Can you tell us a little bit more about what sorts of things your mom did to get your family into the holiday spirit, and just like a bit more about who she was as a person, because she seems so alive in all of the books that you've written, and in Molly's Gran, this character in particular?
Well, my mother is really the force behind Gran. She was really the model that I had, her and a lot of her friends. And the idea of that was to give the reader their own matriarch. Some of us have had wonderful, like your mother sounds just absolutely amazing. I think our mothers would have gotten along.
Probably.
Imagine how they would have put up a tree.
Oh my God. The tree, the Nova Scotia crystal ornaments on my mother's tree, stunning.
So a lot,
yeah.
right? And then my mother would have festooned it with tinsel. It would have been just stunning.
Yeah.
So my mother was one of those people who brought brightness wherever she went. French Canadian, so she had a whole bunch of traditions that were, making the tourtières. That was something that we always did in December, and she would give one to every person we knew. So it was a big deal, and people came to really love that.
That's beautiful. And yeah, the sort of cultural specificity of a French Canadian mom and the holiday preparations that entails is very particular. I want to ask about your mom's role as a storyteller, because from what I understand, she was a bit of a teller of tall tales.
Indeed. When I was a teenager, I did not love the fact that my mother used to, as I thought, quote unquote, make up stories. It used to gall me. So she would tell stories all the time that I'd say, well, that's not true. So she told me one day that in northern Quebec, where she grew up, one day a young girl went down to the river and she died. And then 3 days later, she came back. The only difference was she had a different color hair and different colored eyes. How do you explain it? I mean, it's wild. And I'd be like, Mom, you're making things up again. Stop that. And she'd be like, well, I am not. It's true. It's true in a way. Anyhow, when my mother died, I had some time with my beloved aunt, and we were talking about my mother's penchant for telling tall tales. And I brought up the tallest tale she used to tell about this pig, Huguette, which she claimed all through my childhood that she rode to school every day in northern Quebec. I'm like, come on, this is so far-fetched. This is ridiculous. No, it is true. I rode a pig to school every day. Well, okay, so my mother's gone. I decided to ask Aunt Suzanne, was it really true? And she's like, of course. Huguette was a pig. We lived on a farm, and, the pig was very popular at school with the kids, not so much with the teachers. And so I learned something so very important. I learned that not all of my mother's stories were made up. Some of them were real. And that blurry line between truth and fiction has served me in such poignant ways. And I feel that's really the biggest gift that my mother has ever given me.
I loved reading this story about your mom riding the pig to school, because it is the sort of thing that sounds so far-fetched, especially for me, like having grown up always in relatively more urban areas. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, a pig can't ride to school. I was driving to school listening to the radio with my dad in the car. Like, no one was bringing a pig with them. But I totally have family members, particularly like my mom's parents, the stories that they used to tell. My grandfather is actually still alive. He's 95 years old and still tells crazy stories about growing up in the 30s in rural Cape Breton, of the nature of, like, he didn't ride a pig to school, but there are things that equally sounded just completely
But do you believe them?
Yes, because enough of them have been proved to be true that
go.
we just now kind of have to take everything he says at face value.
Yep.
He once was telling my dad this story about some boxing match that he attended in Chicago in the 50s with like very specific details, and he claimed to have seen Sonny Liston box, and my dad didn't believe him. And so my dad started Googling around to see like what information he could find. It all checked out. The dates, the locations, it completely matched. So we were like, I guess we have to believe this man now.
There you go. I learned the hard way. I'm glad you're learning earlier than I did.
I want to ask about the role of stories more broadly, not just family stories, but reading and books, and what sort of place that had in your childhood? I understand that you were a big reader from a very young age.
I was. I always read, but I did not come from a family that, had a giant library in a parlor, if you know what I mean. So there weren't a lot of books in the house. However, my poor parents were born to a very literate and book-loving, I was born to them. I don't know why. Everyone else in the family was math-oriented, but not me. But I discovered libraries, and libraries were my safe place. They were my savior. I would go in and I would get to take books home, and I would read them in the privacy of my room, often with a flashlight under the covers. Once I was supposed to be sleeping, but don't tell. And they really became my sanctuary in some very profound ways. I remember being incredibly young and going to the public library. I was a very small child. I know I'm pretty giant now, folks. But believe it or not, I was always the smallest kid in class. And I was at the library, and some kids were sort of teasing me and, calling me names based on my diminutive size. And I remember seeing a librarian watching this, and she didn't do anything about it. However, when those kids were gone and I was on my own, the librarian came over to me, and she didn't say anything about what had happened, but she took out a book. And the book was an Aesop's fable, one of the famous ones, about a lion and a mouse, and you probably know it. It's the one where the big mighty lion gets caught up in a net, and the mouse chews away the net in order to free the lion. And of course, the lion doesn't think the mouse is, worthy of anything until its life is saved. She read that fable to me, and I got it. I understood what she was saying. She was trying to give me power again, make me feel good in my skin and good about my size. And that is truly, as you know, Mattea, the power of a book. At the right moment, it can change minds and it can change lives.
And what I think that also shows the power of librarians and the important role that librarians play in so many people's lives.
100%.
The amount of writers that I've spoken to since starting out hosting Bookends and just talking to people about those early relationships with reading who are able to remember by name their local librarian from either their school, their local public library, somebody that introduced them to books that really spoke to them at an early age. It's such a beautiful gift that you can give a young person to develop that relationship. I want to ask, though, so it's one thing to kind of lose yourself or discover yourself in literature as a reader. Different thing to discover yourself in literature as a writer, and especially to put a book out into the world for publication, You were working on, other people's work for 20 years, very high-powered editor, saw lots of authors go through your office. What made you want to pivot to putting your own stories out into the world?
It was a very risky thing to do, and I don't really think I thought it through very logically. I actually consider myself an accidental writer, an accidental novelist, because I loved editing. I loved working with writers. And but one day, something happened. I was in the UK, and I was at the London Book Fair, which is an event that happens every year. It brings writers and publishers together. And I left my hotel room to go to a meeting, and I came back, and I surprised the roommate who was cleaning my room. And she sort of jumped back into a shadowy corner, and this is the embarrassing part. She had in her hands my disgusting, dirty track pants, which were all sweaty because I'd gone for a jog that morning and then thrown them on a bed as I rushed to get ready for my next meeting. And that's what she held in her hands. And when I looked at her, I was embarrassed, she was embarrassed, and I thought to myself, it is such an intimate and invisible job to be a roommate. She'd been cleaning my room for days. She knew everything about me. She knew the makeup I wore, if someone had been in my bed or not, my agenda sitting right there. Everything, and I knew nothing about her. And for some reason, that little moment, even though we never spoke to each other, stuck in my mind. A few days later, I was on my plane ride home, and that's when I heard Molly's voice, the protagonist in all of my novels. And it was so crystal clear. I did not plan, as I say, I was an accidental novelist. I did not plan to write a novel. But I had no paper, I grabbed the napkin under my drink, and I started to write that voice that I was hearing. And it was so powerful that on that napkin, not only was it the beginning of my debut novel, but it kind of convinced me to write the rest.
It's so interesting hearing you talk about this character that sort of emerges fully formed. I'm wondering, you have this idea for a Maid character, this person that's maybe a little bit overlooked, but who knows so much and is in a position to see so much about a lot of different people, especially a maid working at a relatively fancier hotel, oftentimes very important or powerful people. What made you want to write specifically a murder mystery novel featuring this character as the focal point character?
It was pretty clear right from the beginning that I was delivered both Molly the voice and the notion of a mystery. Something has gone terribly wrong in this hotel. The tricky part for me was figuring out how to innovate. The thing about the mystery genre is there are so many writers who've done it so incredibly well. And the question is, if you were like me, changing roles, moving from editor to writer, what am I going to do different? How am I going to make this original? What do I have to offer the genre that maybe is a little bit different? And so I think the notion of combining a murder mystery, which does not sound very jolly, does it, when I say it like that? Not very jolly at all. But with the notion of heart, of a journey of the spirit where we follow this character, Molly, and hopefully by the end of it, our heart grows 2 sizes and we come to love her. So that's really what I wanted to do. Is it possible to marry this notion of the whodunit and the murder mystery with the notion of growing a bigger heart?
Now, you were saying you were a bit of an accidental writer in the sense that you weren't planning to make this career pivot from editing to writing until this idea for this character and this story kind of popped into your head through this encounter. You're now on your 3rd book in the Maid series. You have a 4th one coming out that's a more, we have this novella, this is back to the novel style, longer form mystery in the spring. Once you got into the writing process of that first Maid novel, did you realize that you were working with a big hit, or did you have any idea of what sort of public reception that first book was going to get?
Absolutely not. I was certain that, all of my friends would be forced into reading, and that would be that. And I would learn that I was an abject failure and that I should stay on the editorial side forever. And that notion was really terrifying to me. In a lot of ways, at the beginning, it messed with my brain. In order to finish that first novel, I had to turn that off. All those feelings of doubt and I'm not good enough and what the heck are you doing and how dare you, that are really just part of my psychology, I had to turn all that off. And the way I did it was writing in absolute secrecy. I didn't tell anyone I was writing that first book. And when I mean I told no one, I really mean I told no one. Like my family didn't know, my partner didn't know, and the last people on earth I would have told were people in the publishing industry. Because the cargo on my back was so big, I just felt like, if I fail at this, I'm going to have to go see publishers and agents for the rest of my career who are going to look at me and say, yeah, that was lovely, which in our world is a euphemism for it was really not good. So in order to turn all that fear off, I just wrote at the beginning for one person, myself. I made it from the beginning of the story to the end, hoping that to please myself with what I had on the page, and then after I would decide if it was worth sharing.
I want to dive into a bit more of the character of Molly. For folks who are familiar with her, to sort of get behind what made you develop her character in this particular way. Molly is a person who struggles a little bit with some social skills. She struggles a bit with reading facial expressions, reading the subtext behind people's words. You've said in interviews that she is a neurodivergent character, and I'm wondering, where were you drawing from to craft her personality and some of these little quirks that she has that are a bit different from the average maid working in a hotel?
Yes. Many years ago, before I was an editor, I worked with kids with various special learning needs. And it was such a formative time in my life. Those kids were absolutely amazing. They were challenging, don't get me wrong. There were difficult days. But to this day, I feel like they taught me more than I could ever have taught them. And one of the things that I love to do was go out in public and go on a field trip. And I don't mean necessarily a field trip to a museum or something like that. Sometimes we would just go to the donut shop across the street. And over time, I learned something peculiar. We weren't doing this for the students. We were doing this for everyone else. Because it became really important for regular people going about their day, to see these kids, to engage with these kids, and to get used to them and their minor, what I would call very minor differences. Most of the time, most people out and about treated those students really well, except for the people who didn't. And I will never forget those people. I wasn't aware of it while I was writing Molly in the first book with the Maid. But what I actually did with her character was take all the best characteristics of those students, their dignity, their ability to protect each other, their kindness to others, and I gave them all to Molly as a tribute to those kids.
That's a very sweet story, and I am so curious about the pivot from being a special ed teacher working with kids to being an editor, but that's an entire separate. Oh, interesting.
I can only do, Mattea, I can only do one thing. I can tell stories and I can help people tell stories. It's the same job that I did as an editor, which is the same job I do as a writer, which is the same job I did when I was teaching.
That's fascinating. I mean, I also have had crazy career pivots, and I feel that's always one thing that I think about is what sort of transferable skills can I bring from the jobs that I had that were contract work when I was 19, 20 to the job that I have now. And there's always a through line, but it's not always obvious to the person who's on the outside looking in what that through line is. So that's fascinating. Molly is somebody who also seems to be very invested in mystery as a genre outside of the fact that she becomes embroiled in mysteries. She has this relationship with the television show Columbo that she used to watch with her grandmother. But she's very different from your typical kind of sleuth. She observes very different sorts of details from your traditional detective. There are certain things that she misses because of her neurodivergence and because of her difference. There are other details that she's much more attuned to about the physical layout of rooms and about people's habits. What made you feel like this was a good way perhaps to invert some of those mystery paradigms? Because you were talking earlier about there being certain tropes and certain commonalities between mysteries that you wanted to maybe not just replicate, but to do something a bit different.
Yes, exactly. So if we think of Sherlock Holmes, very classic, he's an excellent detective. He walks into a room, he spots all the anomalies, and very quickly he can solve the case, way before we can, right? I wanted to flip that upside down. I wanted to have a kind of detective who doesn't necessarily notice the obvious clues, but over time, we come to see that her unique view of the world means she sees things that no one else can. And maybe, as a reader, you become surprised by all the things that she can see that you can't.
There were, I think, there's some development in Molly's character over the course of the series, because in preparation for this interview, I initially was okay, I really need to read the Mistletoe Mystery novella, but I wanted to understand more about Molly's characterization, and I found myself really diving into the full trilogy of books that you have so far. Do you feel like her character has sort of developed and progressed? We see her go from this person who's quite socially isolated at the beginning of the first Maid novel to somebody who has a little bit of a found family and a little bit of a community at the end of Mistletoe Mysteries, where she's a bit more supported and maybe a little bit more secure in herself.
Yeah. After the first book, which is really, yes, it's a mystery, but it's also a study of grief. It's a study of a young woman who, for the first time in her life, has to navigate the world without her moral compass, her gran. And she has to do it, and it's difficult. By the time we get to the mystery guest, and most definitely in the Mistletoe Mystery, though, we have a much more confident person. She has learned to establish relationships, to understand social cues, certainly much better than she did at the beginning, and to really show a side of herself that is extremely compassionate to all people, even sometimes people who might not deserve it. And I think what I was trying to do was, replicate something that I experience in real life. So, when we're younger, or when we're in a period of our lives, when we're unsettled, we have to focus on ourselves. We have to focus on self-understanding. And that's what happens in The Maid. But by the time Molly graduates to the mystery guest, she's a different person. She's much more confident. And, like with us in life, Then, only then, when we're feeling like we know who we are, we can reach out to others and start to understand them. So in that second book, she really comes to a much deeper understanding of her grandmother and all the immense sacrifices that woman made in order to make Molly who she is.
Another thread that we've talked about a little bit in this conversation is describing feeling perhaps a bit insecure in one's own position in the world, feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome perhaps in certain things that you're doing. I would say, Molly, the main thrust of the Mistletoe Mystery, as I sort of flagged earlier in the conversation, is that Molly's in a place of feeling quite insecure in a relationship that's very important to her. She has this boyfriend, Juan Manuel, who she really loves and adores, and he seems to adore her. But perhaps because Molly is not always the best at reading social cues, she sometimes mistrusts her own judgment of, can I really believe that this guy is as into me as I think? There are things happening where he's acting a little bit mysteriously, and there are people in her life that are encouraging her to see him with this lens of suspicion. She eventually kind of pushes through all of that and learns to, I guess, just ask questions when she feels like she's in a place where she's not secure. I'm wondering, because you were mentioning earlier, having a bit of a sense of imposter syndrome or insecurity as a writer, I'm wondering whether this book perhaps was a way of working through some of those experiences of insecurity, whether it was in emerging as a writer or perhaps other times in your life that you've maybe felt a little bit unsteady or a little bit unsure of yourself.
100%. It was that and the fact that I couldn't kill another person in the Regency Grand Hotel. How many murders can we have in one hotel before nobody's going to go there anymore? Would you go to a hotel where there were 3 murders in the course of 3 years? I mean, it's not a great place to stay. So I knew I had to, again, innovate the genre, do something different. So in the Mistletoe Mystery, there is no overt crime as such. There is definitely not a murder happening in the hotel. It is a different kind of mystery that has to do with the interiority of Molly's feelings about her, developed lack of trust and having to reckon with that in order to actually pursue the fulfillment of important relationships in her life.
I'm wondering, I guess, whether, not that books need to necessarily be didactic or have a lesson to take away, but, without giving away too much of the plot, how is it that she's able to work through some of those trust issues, and what maybe can readers learn about how she navigates that struggle in her own life?
Well, I think one of the great gifts that her grandmother gave her was that positivity. Gran always talks to her in sayings, and those sayings often are those old classics that always are about putting your best foot forward, doing your best, thinking on the bright side. And while they are cliches, for Molly, they've steeped into her personality, and she can only act from there. So she discovers darkness within herself. She has doubts, a lot of self-doubt, and a lot of doubt about other people around her. But she always tries to get past that and find a way forward, keep moving, and move towards the light, towards kindness, towards goodness. And if that is not a message for today, I don't know what is.
Yeah, very thematic. Make the season kind, very thematic indeed. I'm glad you brought up these sayings of Molly's gran, because that's such a part of really, obviously Molly's gran's personality, but it's such a part of Molly's personality, right? The fact that this person who's a family member who's departed is clearly so influential for her still and really isn't gone. And as you were saying at the very top of our conversation, kind of lives on through the presence of these sayings. Was there a specific inspiration in your own life for these sayings? Was your mom or somebody else important to you, a person of sayings, of kind of having these little aphorisms that were guides of how to live life?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. That was my mom again. She loved those old sayings, but as I mentioned before, she was French-Canadian, and so English was her second language, and she dominated it very well, except for with sayings. So she would often mess them up, and it was quite hilarious. I remember being fairly young, and something happened at school, and I was in trouble for something with somebody, and I came back home, and I told her the story. And she listened, and I, of course, blamed the other person for everything, because how could it possibly? I didn't have anything to do, no responsibility here. And she looked at me, and she said, "Well, Nita, it takes two to tangle. I'm like, Mom, what are you talking, what are you trying to say, two to tango? Is that what you mean? She's like, you heard me the first time. So she loved sayings like that. She used them all the time, but she slightly mangled them, which made them extremely memorable to me. So in making this relationship between Molly and Gran, I went back to that voice, that voice that I still hear, my mother's voice, which is in some ways more present to me in my own mind today than even when she was alive. It's more distilled, and she's there whenever I need her. And I created Gran, who has much more British sensitivity, I would say, than my mother's, as somebody who would always speak to her granddaughter in these sayings that would become a long-living guide way after her death.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. Like, as someone who's also lost a parent, like, I definitely have had that experience of when a person's gone, they're still very much with you, but it's that distilled essence of, because you're not able to talk to them on a day-to-day basis, you have their most memorable sayings and their most memorable isms.
And how does that happen for you? Tell us.
I would say, for me, the one top thing that I think about all the time that my dad used to tell me is if I was having a bad time, specifically when I first moved out of the house and was like in Toronto on my own and just suffering because I moved out of the house at 16, he would be like, well, Mattea, it's every day you have to take the incremental steps. This was his way of like telling me to eat breakfast and like all of the things that you are supposed to do for your health that very annoyingly actually do work. And so if I'm having a day where I'm just like, I just can't get out of bed, I can't do my laundry, it's like that is the voice that I hear. And it does actually compel me to do it because I'm like, he'd be mad if I didn't do the laundry today. Let's get on with it.
So have you taken your incremental steps today?
Actually, you know what? Yeah. I had a little donut backstage. I'm eating my breakfast. My laundry is clean. It's great.
Your dad would be very proud of this.
I hope so.
Yes.
I hope so. Your mom would be very proud of you too, I'm sure.
Thank you.
I want to pivot to the future a little bit. As we mentioned earlier, you have a new book in the Maid series coming out in the spring. You alluded to the fact earlier that we can't keep having murders at the Regency Grand. It would simply become untenable. People would not be staying at this hotel anymore, no matter how nice the service is and no matter how deluxe the accommodations. Can you tell us a little bit about the next book in the Maid series and what's the vibe going to be? How are you going to bring these characters out of the Regency Grand and maybe out into the world?
So The Maid's Secret is coming out in April, and it is a slightly different kind of mystery yet again. So on the front hand, there are no murders, but there is a heist. So Molly is at the Regency Grand working away. She's doing really well. So is Juan Manuel. And there is a road show that comes to the hotel. And it's sort of an antiques road show style. And Molly, on a whim, brings a shoebox of her grand's old things. Lo and behold, one of the things in those shoebox might be something very, very valuable, and I'm going to think that some readers out there who've read the previous books might be able to guess what that is. So we have a heist that happens when that is discovered to be a very expensive thing, and Molly is instantly a multimillionaire. But in the back end, we have, for the first time, a new narrator. It's Gran. So we hear from her, and we hear her first-person story of when she grew up and had a very different story from Molly's, who's just become very wealthy. Gran started out, in fact, very, very wealthy, and she lost everything. But the one thing she didn't lose was love. It is an epic, grand, Downton Abbey-style love story in the back end, a heist novel in the beginning, and I've, again, tried to put two unlike things together, Frankensteining them together in this strange way, and I'm very, very hopeful that readers will enjoy this grand finale of the series.
Well, that was a very good pitch, I would say. I'm certainly looking forward to it based on that description.
Thank you.
That's that publishing executive experience. You know how to sell. That's fantastic. Interesting, you mentioned grand finale of the series. I'm wondering, what made you feel like this was going to be a nice coda? I'm sure that you could probably have continued writing Maid novels till the cows come home and finding new ways to put these characters in situations where they have to uncover a mystery. What makes you feel like this is the time and place to end Molly's story?
Respect for my readers. Because of my long editorial career, I'm very attuned to giving more to my readers rather than less. And I feel like this is a trilogy with a little extra in the Mistletoe Mystery, and that this is going to give readers a lovely sense of closure. And I would like to say, it is the end, but it is never really the end, and Molly will always be with you.
Aww. That's so sweet. Well, Nita, thank you so much for coming in to join us today. Thank you also to everybody who's here with us in studio. It's so nice to see a full room, and what a fantastic way to kick off the holiday season. Nita, wishing you all the best with promoting Mistletoe Mystery, with everything that's going to come with the promotional cycle for the next book, and for all of your future endeavors. I'm sure lots of folks that are listening to us today are so excited to read The Maid Secret and anything else that you put out. So thank you again.
Thank you, Mattea. Thank you all.
That was my conversation with Nita Prose about her new book, The Mistletoe Mystery. We spoke at the Glenn Gould Studio in Toronto, and that event was part of CBC's holiday fundraiser for food banks called Make the Season Kind. There's still time to get involved, and you can go to cbc.ca/kind to learn more. Thank you to everyone who came out to the show on what was a very cold and snowy day here in Toronto. Today's show was produced by Lisa Matthews with help from Eileen Yamamoto. Special thanks to Jonathan Stainton, Angela Moore, Shanna Cohen, and the amazing team at the Glenn Gould Studio. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Erin Balser. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio, or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Happy holidays, and thanks for listening. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.